The office lights buzzed with that faint, electric hum you only notice when you've stayed too late. Rachel Torres rubbed her eyes and looked at the spreadsheet glowing across her laptop screen. Another column, another formula, another night alone with numbers that seemed to matter more to the company than the people behind them. Outside her window, New York pulsed. The towers of lower Manhattan shimmered with office lights stacked like constellations. Somewhere down there, traders were still celebrating bonuses in rooftop bars, their laughter echoing against glass. Meanwhile, Rachel sat on the 22nd floor of Carter Financial's headquarters, a single mother crunching data for people who would never remember her name. She glanced at the photo taped beside her monitor, her daughter, Ava, gap-toothed and smiling, holding a stuffed rabbit like it was treasure. 9 years old, 3rd grade, obsessed with dinosaurs this month. Ava was the reason Rachel kept going, the reason she stayed in this cubicle long after her colleagues left. Excel doesn't lie, Rachel whispered, half to herself. But she knew people did. The report she was building was monumental: vendor consolidations across 3 divisions, projected savings in the millions, the kind of breakthrough that usually catapulted a senior partner into headlines. Rachel wasn't a senior partner. She wasn't even considered strategic. She was a staff accountant who happened to notice the cracks, vendor redundancies, invoice trails that didn't line up, deals that bled money like open wounds. For 2 weeks straight, she'd worked until 2 a.m., living on bad coffee and vending machine pretzels, pulling invoices apart line by line. She'd found the pattern, built the model, and polished the deck until it gleamed. And yet, she knew when tomorrow came, the credit wouldn't. She had seen the way Greg Stanton, her division head, lingered around her desk. How he asked innocent questions, just curious, "Rachel, what assumptions did you use in that model?" Then disappeared for days, only to return with a smirk and a new initiative to present upstairs. Greg was ambitious in the way only mediocre men could be, bold with other people's work, allergic to details, but always ready to shine under fluorescent lights. Rachel wasn't bitter. Not exactly. She was tired. Tired of the way her contributions slid into someone else's PowerPoint. Tired of being the note-taker in meetings where her own ideas strutted in someone else's voice. Tired of watching men in loafers and tailored suits play motivational speaker while she nursed a stress migraine in the back row. The trail mix bag in the HR fridge was her dinner. She ate it without tasting, watching the clock creep toward midnight. She should have gone home hours ago. Ava would already be asleep, tucked in by Mrs. Delgado, the neighbor who watched her most nights when Rachel stayed late. Guilt gnawed at her. Every missed bedtime, every PTA meeting she skipped, every art project she couldn't admire in person, it all built into a quiet weight pressing against her chest. But then she thought of the number blinking on her screen, $2.1 million in projected annual savings. That was her number. Her proof. Her shot. If Carter Financial wanted to ignore her, fine. But one day, someone would have to notice. She shut down her laptop, the screen fading into black. The office around her was silent now, a ghost town of abandoned cubicles and ergonomic chairs. Only the city kept moving, relentless and alive. Rachel packed her bag, slid the photo of Ava back into her wallet, and stood. As she stepped into the elevator, her reflection caught in the mirrored walls. A woman of 35, hair pulled back, dark circles under her eyes, still wearing the same navy blazer she'd bought 3 years ago on clearance. She didn't look like a future executive. She looked like someone corporate America had already decided was replaceable. But Rachel knew something they didn't. She knew where the bodies were buried, inside the spreadsheets, the contracts, the forgotten clauses no one bothered to read. And she was done being overlooked. The boardroom smelled faintly of polished wood and burnt coffee. Rachel sat 3 chairs from the end, laptop open, fingers ready to type notes she didn't need to take. She already knew this presentation word for word, because she had written it. At the head of the table stood Greg Stanton. Crisp gray suit, loafers buffed to a shine, that salesman grin plastered across his face. He paced with the rhythm of someone who thought motion equaled confidence. Behind him, the screen glowed with a title slide, Operational Efficiency Audit, Vendor Consolidation Strategy. Rachel's breath caught. That was her deck. Her framework. Her projections. Greg didn't even glance her way as he launched into the pitch. By consolidating redundant vendor contracts across our Tier 2 divisions, we project an annual savings of, he paused for effect, clicking to the next slide. $2.1 million. Applause rippled around the table. The CFO leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. Smart work, Greg. This could actually fix the vendor bleed we've been battling. Rachel's throat went dry. That number, that phrasing, even the typo on the X-axis label, her typo, were staring back at her. It was like watching someone steal her voice and perform it as their own monologue. She looked around the table. Not one face turned to her. Not one director remembered that she'd been the one buried in spreadsheets until dawn, while Greg was off golfing with the VP of Operations. They were too busy nodding, impressed, ready to give credit to the loudest voice in the room. Emily, could you capture some of this for the wiki? Greg tossed the request over his shoulder without breaking stride. He didn't even get her name right. She was Rachel, not Emily. But she typed anyway, hands trembling. Her words recorded her own erasure. Slide after slide, Greg strutted through her models, acting as if he'd cracked some secret code. The directors leaned forward, jotting notes, nodding approval. Rachel's chest tightened with every word. This was supposed to be her breakthrough. Her chance to prove she was more than just a faceless accountant. Instead, she was the stenographer to her own disappearance. When the meeting ended, the room buzzed with congratulations. Brilliant, one director said. Timely, said another. Greg smiled modestly, waving off their praise with false humility. Rachel shut her laptop quietly, packed her bag, and slipped out before anyone could notice the storm behind her eyes. She didn't stop at her desk. She didn't even breathe until she reached the HR floor. Karen, the HR partner, sat behind a desk decorated with succulents and a framed quote about teamwork. She looked up with the weary cheerfulness of someone used to complaints about parking spots and ergonomic chairs. Rachel. What can I do for you? Rachel's voice was steady, but her heart pounded. I need to file an attribution concern. Karen blinked, then tapped her keyboard like she was inputting a lunch order. Okay. Tell me more. Rachel laid it out. The timestamps. The file history. Slack messages where Greg had complimented her proposal before going silent, only to reappear this morning with it repackaged as his own. She even had the original draft with her name stamped on the cover page. When she finished, Karen didn't look shocked. She looked tired. Well, technically, you're still considered a junior support resource, she said gently, as if Rachel had misunderstood her own life. Greg is your direct manager, and final attribution for internal initiatives usually falls to senior leadership. But it was my analysis, Rachel said, voice sharper now. Karen smiled again, the kind of smile that closed doors instead of opening them. We don't negotiate with junior staff, Rachel. The sentence sliced deeper than any insult. We don't negotiate with junior staff. Like she was a child who'd wandered into the adults' table at Thanksgiving. Like her work, her late nights, her sacrifices, missing birthdays, missing bedtime stories, were nothing more than free labor for Greg's glory. Rachel didn't cry. She didn't scream. She nodded. Right. Of course. Could I get a printed copy of my original onboarding contract, please? Just for compliance reasons. Karen blinked, surprised. That's a first, she said, half joking. But she printed it, stapled the pages, and slid the packet across the desk like it was a pity brochure. Rachel tucked it into her bag, thanked her, and walked out. Past Greg's office, where laughter spilled through the door as he bragged to someone on the apartment smelled faintly of lavender detergent and leftover pad thai. Rachel tossed her bag on the kitchen counter, pulled off her blazer, and let herself sink into the worn chair at the small table. The city outside her window never slept, but in here, everything was still, too still. She slid the stapled contract packet out of her bag and laid it flat on the table. Its plasticky paper gleamed under the yellow light of her desk lamp. Rachel stared at it for a long time, fingers hovering over the first page, as if she were about to touch something dangerous. Her daughter's voice drifted from the next room. "Mom?" Ava's hair was messy from sleep, her stuffed rabbit clutched under one arm. She rubbed her eyes. "Why are you still up?" Rachel asked gently. "Nightmare," Ava whispered. Rachel opened her arms, and Ava curled into her lap. For a moment, the anger from earlier melted. Rachel kissed the top of her daughter's head, breathing in the familiar scent of shampoo. She whispered, "Go back to bed, sweetheart. I'll be there soon." When Ava finally returned to her room, Rachel turned back to the contract. She flipped through the first few pages, boilerplate, non-disparagement, arbitration clauses, the same suffocating language every corporate employee signed without a second thought. She almost stopped there, but something in her gut told her to keep going. By page 5, her eyes were stinging. Legalese wrapped around itself like barbed wire. But then she turned to page 6. The formatting looked different, narrower margins, font slightly off, like it had been pasted in from another document. At the top, bold letters stared back at her. Section 12, Founder's Operational Continuity Clause. Rachel froze. Her heart raced as she read the words. Any employee classified as a contributor to internal innovation pipelines within the first 36 months of employment shall, upon verified implementation of said contributions, be entitled to elevated status. A. Scope sign-off authority. B. Access to equity renegotiation proceedings. C. Veto power on future iterations of said contributions if codified under internal IP tracking protocols. Her mouth went dry. She read it again. And again. At the bottom of the page, 2 signatures. One was hers, scrawled carelessly in black ink. She'd been half distracted, probably wondering if the break room still had oat milk when she signed it. The other was Elliot Travers. The founder. The man who had built Carter Financial decades ago, back when it was a scrappy midtown consultancy. White-haired, Hawaiian shirt-wearing, half-checked out by the time Rachel joined. He'd been the kind of eccentric figure people joked about in hushed tones, Santa Claus with a Bluetooth headset. She remembered their only meeting. During her onboarding review, Elliot had shuffled into the conference room, looked at her rotation summary, and said, "Keep your eyes on the gaps." No one ever bothers to look there. She had thought he was just being poetic. But now it felt like prophecy. The clause wasn't secret. It wasn't hidden. It was just forgotten. Buried under mountains of HR policy and compliance training. A legacy clause, maybe a relic, but still binding. And Rachel had triggered it without even knowing. Her hands shook as she grabbed her laptop. She pulled up her personal drive, opened the original draft of the vendor consolidation proposal, and compared it with the rollout memo Greg had presented. Identical. Her formatting, her ROI projection graph, even the typo Greg hadn't bothered to fix. That meant one thing, verified implementation. Which meant the clause was alive. Rachel leaned back, staring at the ceiling as the realization sank in. Greg hadn't just stolen her work. By pushing it live, he had accidentally handed her the keys to a clause that gave her power, real power. She whispered to herself, "God, they buried gold and gave me the shovel." It wasn't rage she felt. Rage was messy, loud, combustible. This was something colder, sharper, like standing on a cliff and finally seeing the path below. She got up, filled the kettle, and made tea. Then she printed a fresh page, copied the exact wording of Section 12(c), and reattached Elliot Travers' scanned signature from her onboarding packet. She slid the page into a new folder, labeled it Operational Continuity Renegotiation, and placed it neatly beside her contract. The next morning, Rachel woke before the sun. Her apartment was quiet except for the rumble of delivery trucks outside and the soft breathing of her daughter in the next room. She poured herself coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared again at the claws she had unearthed the night before. Section 12. Elliot Travers' signature. Verified implementation. She traced her finger over the words like they were a map to some hidden world. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Saw Greg's deck yesterday. Strong work. Surprised not to see your name on it. M. Rachel's stomach tightened. There was only one person in the building who signed texts that way, Marcus Cole, Chief Operating Officer. He was rumored to be next in line for the CEO position once the board finalized the transition. She stared at the screen, wondering how much he knew. Then she typed carefully. Thanks, but credit doesn't always land where it should. No reply came. But the fact that he had reached out at all was enough to set her pulse racing. By mid-morning, Rachel was at her desk, combing through old onboarding files, looking for any additional notes from Elliot Travers. Most were generic HR fluff, but one folder caught her eye: Employee Rotation Reports, Confidential. Inside was a PDF labeled with her name, time-stamped from her first year at Carter. She opened it and felt her breath catch. The document contained notes from multiple executives evaluating her early work. Most were bland: strong analytical ability, good team player. But one note, written in bold ink, stood out. Torres identifies structural redundancies others overlook. Retain close. Potential long-term asset. MC. Marcus Cole. Rachel leaned back in her chair. She remembered those early months, the long hours she had pulled during her rotation program, and how Marcus had stopped by her cubicle more than once. He had been different then, still ambitious, but less polished, less guarded. They had even gone out once, a drink after work that ended with laughter, too much tequila, and one night Rachel never spoke of again. Her throat tightened. Ava was 9 years old. 9 years since that night. She'd buried the connection, convinced herself it was coincidence, a slip in judgment, something best left in the past. Marcus had moved on, rising quickly through the corporate ranks, while Rachel had chosen to raise her daughter quietly, keeping their lives separate. But now, staring at the clause in her contract, she realized the truth wasn't buried as deep as she thought. Marcus had left a mark, not just on her career but on her child's life. And if this clause went public, if her name was forced into board conversations, into IPO documentation, Marcus would see it. He would connect the dots. Rachel's hands shook as she closed the file. This wasn't just about intellectual property anymore. It was personal. Intimately, dangerously personal. At lunch, she slipped outside, walking past the vendors on the crowded Manhattan sidewalk, her mind spinning. Wall Street men in tailored suits brushed past, barking into phones, while she stood frozen at the corner, the contract folder clutched against her chest. For years, she had convinced herself she was powerless. Just another overworked accountant, invisible to the giants in the glass towers. But the clause had changed everything. It gave her leverage, against Greg, against the CFO, even against Marcus. The question was, should she use it? She pictured Ava, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, coloring dinosaurs with crayon. Her daughter had no idea her father was one of the most powerful men in New York. And maybe that was safer. But Rachel also knew this company, its greed, its secrets, its tendency to chew people up and spit them out. If she didn't fight, Ava's future could be shaped by men like Greg and Marcus, men who thought power was their birthright. That night, Rachel tucked Ava into bed, kissed her forehead, and lingered at the doorway. The little girl looked so peaceful, so untouched by the storm building outside their apartment walls. Rachel whispered into the dark, "They won't erase me again." Because this time, it wasn't just her career on the line. It was her daughter's name, her future. And Rachel would burn every clause, every boardroom, every dollar of Carter Financial to the ground before she let them take that away. The following week moved in slow motion, every hour stretched taut like a rubber band about to snap. Rachel kept her head down at Carter Financial, crunching numbers, updating spreadsheets, pretending nothing had changed. To her colleagues, she was the same quiet accountant with tired eyes and a reliable work ethic. But under the surface, her world had shifted. The claws sat heavy in her bag, tucked between a notebook and a granola bar. She carried it everywhere, on the subway, through the lobby, even to the break room. She told herself it was for safekeeping, but truthfully, she couldn't let it out of her sight. It wasn't paper anymore. It was dynamite. Every time Greg swaggered past her desk, laughing too loud, Rachel's chest tightened. He still hadn't thanked her. He still acted like the vendor consolidation project was his brainchild. Worse, she heard whispers that the board was considering him for a promotion. If that happened, her work would become the cornerstone of his rise. He would wear her brilliance like a tailored suit while she remained invisible. But if she invoked the clause, everything would change. One morning, riding the packed subway downtown, Rachel ran the scenarios in her mind. Scenario 1, she filed the renegotiation officially. Legal confirmed it, and she gained standing. But that would make her a target, Greg, the CFO, even Marcus. They wouldn't forgive her for pulling a relic clause out of the archives and using it to upend their hierarchy. Scenario 2, she stayed silent, let the project roll forward, and watched her name dissolve into corporate fog. Safer, yes, but suffocating. She looked at her reflection in the subway window. The woman staring back looked older than 35, older than she felt. Dark circles, tight jaw, eyes that had forgotten how to rest. Ava deserved better than a mother who surrendered to men like Greg and Marcus. At the office that afternoon, the CFO, Mr. Dacro, stopped by her floor. He rarely descended to the cubicles, which made the visit notable. He shook Greg's hand, clapped him on the shoulder, and said loudly, "Solid work on the consolidation." The board's impressed. Rachel's ears rang. The words felt like bricks pressing down on her chest. Solid work. The board's impressed. It was her work, her late nights, her sacrifices. And she was being erased again, brick by brick, until nothing remained. That evening, she didn't go straight home. She walked to Battery Park, where the Hudson stretched black and glittering under the city lights. The winter air bit at her skin, but she welcomed the sting. She pulled the clause from her bag, unfolded it, and held it up against the skyline. One page of forgotten ink, and it could topple men who thought they were untouchable. But it could also topple her. She thought about Marcus. The COO. The man who didn't know his daughter lived 10 subway stops away. If she filed the clause, his signature in her onboarding file would resurface. He would connect the dots. The board would connect them too. The headlines would write themselves: Scandal inside Carter Financial, COO's secret ties to junior analyst. Her pulse quickened at the thought. Was she ready for that? Was Ava? Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. A message from Mrs. Delgado. Ava's asking when you'll be home. Says she wants you to read the dinosaur book. Rachel folded the clause carefully, slid it back into her bag, and started walking. She couldn't let fear decide. Not this time. She had been overlooked too long, erased too many times. Ava deserved a mother who fought, not one who folded. By the time she reached her apartment, the decision was made. She would act, but she would act smart. Quiet. Surgical. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. That night, after Ava fell asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit, Rachel sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. She opened her laptop, created a new folder, and labeled it Continuity Evidence. Inside, she began dropping files, her original draft, version histories, Slack messages, timestamps, everything that proved the consolidation was hers. She wasn't ready to detonate the clause just yet. But she was building the trigger. As midnight slipped past, Rachel whispered into the stillness. They wanted me invisible. Let's see how invisible I am when my name is written into their contracts. And for the first time in years, the risk didn't feel paralyzing. Friday afternoons at Carter Financial were usually slow. People left early, claiming client dinners that were really just weekend escapes. The office air carried a lazy quiet, the kind that made secrets easier to plant. Rachel had been waiting for this moment. For days, she prepared the evidence, polished, time-stamped, airtight. Every draft of her proposal, every Slack compliment from Greg, every version control entry was stacked neatly in digital folders and backed up twice. On her desk sat the printed copy of Section 12, its faded watermark glowing faintly under the fluorescent lights like a relic no one else had cared to touch. Her plan wasn't dramatic. She wasn't going to storm into the boardroom and shout. That would be reckless, noisy, and easy to dismiss. No, Rachel needed precision. A scalpel, not a sledgehammer. She typed slowly, deliberately, crafting the addendum. Per Section 12(c) of the Founder's Operational Continuity Clause, effective March 17, year redacted, this filing confirms verified implementation of protected internal contribution. Requesting elevation to scope sign-off authority and eligibility for equity renegotiation as stipulated. Supporting documentation attached. Signature, Rachel Torres. Her hands didn't shake. She had practiced this moment in her head too many times. She slid Elliot Travers' scanned signature page from her onboarding packet into the attachment, the founder's sloppy scrawl beside hers. 2 names, one forgotten, one dismissed, suddenly carrying the weight of a bomb. Rachel uploaded the document into the HR system. The portal was clunky, a SharePoint knockoff with gray buttons and tooltips that read like passive-aggressive sighs. She selected Role Development Contractual Review. Click. Upload. Submit. No alarms went off. No emails popped up. The document slid silently into the stack, logged and time-stamped. By Monday morning, compliance protocols would force a review. One HR had already tripped by acknowledging her filing. Karen, with her tired smile and succulence, had unknowingly validated Rachel's trap. Rachel leaned back, exhaling slowly. It was done. Just then, Greg swaggered past her desk, phone pressed to his ear, grinning like a man who thought the world was a stage built just for him. Yeah, the CFO loved it, he said loudly. Board's looking at promotion talks. We're golden. Rachel stared at her monitor, expression blank. If he noticed the faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, he didn't show it. He was too busy congratulating himself for stealing her work, oblivious to the fact that his victory lap was running straight into her minefield. That evening, at home, Rachel set the kettle on and opened her laptop again. She reread the clause, letting every word sink in like scripture. Veto power. Equity renegotiation. Scope authority. She whispered them aloud, tasting the syllables. They didn't sound like corporate jargon anymore. They sounded like weapons. She looked over at Ava, sprawled on the living room rug, coloring a brontosaurus bright blue. For her daughter, this wasn't just about money or recognition. It was about legacy. About showing Ava that her mother wasn't someone people could erase. At 9 p.m., Rachel's phone buzzed. An email from HR. Subject, received, role development submission. Body, hi Rachel, received your documentation. Adding this to your personnel file. Love the enthusiasm. Most staff wait until year 5 for renegotiation, but hey, got to respect the energy. Cheers, Karen. Rachel laughed quietly. The email was dismissive, condescending even. But it was perfect. Karen had just confirmed receipt without escalating it to legal. That single oversight meant compliance was already compromised. Rachel closed her laptop, poured herself tea, and sat by the window. Manhattan's skyline blinked in the distance, glass towers glowing against the night. To the people inside them, she was still invisible. Just another junior analyst. But come Monday morning, when legal finally opened her submission and saw Elliot Travers' name on the scanned signature, when the clause screamed back to life from the dead, they would realize the truth. Rachel Torres wasn't invisible. She was the Monday morning arrived with the sterile chill of corporate routine. The elevator doors opened on the 22nd floor, and Rachel stepped into a sea of cubicles buzzing with the usual chatter, weekend recaps, bad coffee jokes, the sound of keyboards clattering like rain. To anyone watching, she looked the same as always. Plain navy blazer, hair tied back, laptop bag slung over her shoulder. The kind of employee you could pass in the hall and forget 2 seconds later. That was her shield, invisibility. But underneath, everything had changed. She settled at her desk, opened her laptop, and waited. Emails trickled in, weekly reports, calendar invites, HR newsletters nobody read. Nothing about her filing. Perfect. That meant it was still buried, sitting quietly in the system, waiting for compliance to trip over it. Greg strutted past her cubicle mid-morning, humming like a man already practicing his victory speech. He didn't even glance at her. Why would he? In his mind, Rachel was already erased. She sipped her coffee, smiled faintly, and began her real work. Her home desktop had been her staging ground, but now it was time to build redundancy. She opened a hidden folder on her work laptop labeled innocuously as Q4 Notes. Inside, she layered everything: the original vendor consolidation draft with her name in the metadata, Slack exchanges where Greg had praised her sharp eye, the version history showing her edits days before Greg's copy, and finally, the rollout deck that still carried her typo like a scar. Each file was cross-referenced, time-stamped, and zipped into encrypted bundles. She uploaded copies to a private cloud account, then printed hard copies to stash in a plain black binder she kept tucked inside her desk drawer. If the system lost anything, she wouldn't. By lunchtime, she was in the cafeteria, pushing a salad around her plate, pretending to listen to 2 coworkers debate Netflix shows. But her mind was elsewhere, mapping scenarios, predicting moves. Greg would overplay his hand. HR would underestimate her. Legal would panic once they saw the founder's name on the clause. And Marcus would do whatever it took to protect the IPO, even if it meant burying her twice. That night, Rachel transformed her kitchen into a war room. The contract lay at the center, flanked by her laptop, stacks of documents, and sticky notes that crawled across the table like vines. On one note, she wrote, "Timeline, Discovery Filing Compliance Explosion." On another, "Weak links, Greg, HR, CFO. Wild card, Marcus." She stuck the notes to the edge of her laptop, the words glaring back at her like battle plans. Ava wandered into the kitchen, holding her dinosaur book. "Mom, can you read?" Rachel blinked, pulled back from the web of papers. She scooped her daughter onto her lap and read the story of a stegosaurus while her mind ran parallel, thinking about predators, about survival, about creatures that thrived by adapting faster than their enemies. When Ava was tucked into bed, Rachel returned to the table. She began drafting a timeline of her own career, the overlooked projects, the quiet contributions. For years, she'd been building the company's backbone in silence, and now she was assembling proof of every bone. At midnight, she whispered to herself, "They think I'm cornered. But I'm just patient." The next day, the first crack appeared. A junior compliance officer stopped by her desk, nervous, clutching a folder. "Rachel, small question. Did you, by any chance, submit something for role development review last week?" Her heart skipped, but her face stayed neutral. "Yes." "Why?" The officer hesitated. "It's unusual. Old clause. Founder signature." Kicked up a flag. "Legals, asking questions." Rachel gave a polite smile. "Thank you for letting me know." When the officer walked away, Rachel leaned back in her chair. The fuse had been lit. She had her binder of evidence, her digital backups, her quiet confidence. Greg thought he was untouchable. HR thought she was harmless. Marcus thought she'd stay invisible. But Rachel Torres was no longer overlooked. She was waiting. Watching. Setting up the endgame, one quiet move at a time. The summons came just before noon. Rachel was reviewing vendor invoices when a notification popped up on her screen. Meeting request, 1 p.m., conference room 10B. Required attendees, Rachel Torres, Greg Stanton, Karen L., CFO Dacro. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't a check-in. It was a trap. At 12:58, Rachel walked the long hallway toward 10B. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, echoing louder than her heartbeat. Through the glass walls, she saw them already seated. Greg leaned back, smug as ever. Karen from HR sat with her clipboard like a referee who already knew the winner. And at the head of the table, CFO Martin Dacro, face flushed, tie loosened, eyes sharp. Rachel stepped inside, calm mask in place. Rachel, Dacro began, no greeting, no smile. He waved a document in the air. We need to talk about this. She sat across from him, folding her hands neatly on the table. Of course. What's the concern? Greg jumped in before the CFO could answer. Let's not waste time. She's been submitting frivolous paperwork, outdated clauses, misinterpreting legal language. It's disruptive. Rachel turned her gaze on him, steady and unblinking. Frivolous? Greg smirked. Yes. Section 12 is a legacy relic. It's ceremonial at best. Everyone knows that. Everyone, Rachel repeated softly, except the founder who signed it. For a moment, the room went quiet. Even Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Dacro slapped the paper down on the table. Don't get cute. This clause hasn't been enforced in years. It doesn't give you veto power. You're junior staff. You don't have that kind of authority. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, measured. With respect, it's not about authority. It's about compliance. The project Greg presented last week implemented my framework verbatim. Verified implementation triggers the clause automatically. Whether you like it or not. Greg scoffed. She's twisting it, Martin. She just wants credit. Look, if we start letting analysts dictate policy, we'll never get anything done. Rachel reached into her folder and slid a printout across the table. This is the original draft. Time-stamped, stored in my drive, with metadata intact. Here's the rollout memo Greg presented. Note the identical phrasing and even the same typo on the ROI graph. Compliance reviewed it yesterday. They already flagged it. Karen's pen stopped mid-scribble. Dacro's jaw clenched. He skimmed the documents, his face shifting from irritation to something closer to alarm. Rachel didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, if the clause is invalid, then you have nothing to worry about. But if it's valid, and you filed investor materials using my work without attribution, then you're exposed. Very exposed. Greg's smirk faltered. You're bluffing. Rachel tilted her head. Am I? The silence stretched until the CFO broke it. Enough. We'll escalate this to legal. He pushed the papers back toward her as if touching them burned. Until then, keep your head down and don't discuss this outside this room. That's an order. Rachel gathered the documents slowly, deliberately. Of course, she said, her tone polite but edged with steel. As she stood to leave, Greg muttered under his breath, this is ridiculous. Rachel paused at the door, turned back, and looked directly at him. What's ridiculous is thinking you could erase me without consequence. Then she walked out, leaving the three of them in a room that suddenly felt smaller, tighter, more dangerous. Back at her desk, Rachel's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You made an impression today. Let's talk. MC. Marcus Cole. The COO. Rachel stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. The confrontation had ended, but the real war was only beginning. The first sign of trouble came Tuesday morning, before Rachel even made it to her desk. She stopped at the lobby cafe for a black coffee, scrolling through headlines on her phone. That's when she saw it, buried 3 articles down on a finance blog notorious for scooping rumors before the mainstream press. Carter Financial faces questions over internal attribution, IPO materials under scrutiny. Her chest tightened. She clicked. The article was vague, but the undertones were unmistakable. Anonymous sources claimed a junior analyst had filed a challenge to an operational proposal that was being positioned as a cornerstone of Carter's upcoming IPO. Words like compliance flag and founder clause littered the piece. It didn't name names. Not yet. But Rachel knew. She was the story. By the time she reached the 22nd floor, the building felt different. Conversations hushed as she passed. Coworkers glanced up from their monitors, then quickly looked away. The air carried the nervous static of a rumor spreading too fast to control. Greg was already in full damage control mode. He stood in the hallway outside his office, voice raised, insisting to anyone within earshot that the story was nonsense. Legacy clauses don't matter. This is a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion. His face was red, his collar damp with sweat. Rachel slipped quietly into her cubicle, logged in, and found her inbox flooded. Compliance wanted clarifications. Investor relations requested documents. A junior from legal had scheduled a meeting with her ASAP. Her heart pounded, but she stayed calm. She'd prepared for this. Every file was backed up, every timestamp locked in place. By mid-morning, chaos rippled beyond the walls of Carter. The stock ticker in the lobby glowed red. Shares of Carter Financial had dipped 3% on whispers of internal governance disputes. On Wall Street, perception was everything. And perception was slipping. Around noon, Jenna from Investor Relations appeared at Rachel's desk. She looked pale, her voice clipped. Rachel, the board is panicking. Investors are calling non-stop. They want attribution clarified immediately. Do you understand what that means? Rachel closed her laptop, met Jenna's eyes, and said evenly, yes. It means they finally have to read the contract. Jenna exhaled sharply, as if Rachel had confirmed her worst fear. The founder's signature is in play, isn't it? Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. That afternoon, she watched the panic unfold like a spectator at a play she had already memorized. Emails flew across the company, urgent, attribution review. Compliance call with legal, mandatory. The words material breach began appearing in threads like a contagion. Greg stormed past her cubicle, muttering into his phone. This is sabotage. She's unstable. She's trying to tank the company. He slammed his office door so hard the glass rattled. Rachel didn't flinch. She opened her binder, reviewed her evidence one more time, and felt the calm of someone holding the truth in a room full of liars. By evening, the leak had reached bigger outlets. Bloomberg ran a headline, Carter Financial's IPO faces potential delay amid governance concerns. CNBC aired a segment speculating about a mysterious internal challenge. The phrase founder's clause was repeated like an incantation. Rachel sat in her apartment, TV on mute, Ava coloring dinosaurs on the floor beside her. The skyline outside flickered with red tickers and flashing news alerts. For years, she had been invisible. Overlooked. Erased. But now her existence rippled through markets, shaved millions off valuations, and had investors pacing penthouse offices in panic. She poured herself tea, took a slow sip, and whispered into the quiet, now they see me. Her phone buzzed. A single message from Marcus Cole, the COO. We need to talk. Tonight. Rachel looked over at Ava, safe in her little world of crayons and paper dinosaurs. She thought of the storm brewing on Wall Street, of Greg unraveling, of Dacro sweating through his tie, of the board scrambling. The email hit Rachel's inbox at 7:42 a.m. sharp. Subject: Confidential board session, mandatory attendance. Location: Executive Conference Room A+ founder link enclosed. Her eyes froze on those last 3 words. Founder link. She knew exactly what that meant. Elliot Travers, the ghost of Carter Financial's past, was returning. Rachel had only met him once, back during her onboarding nearly 3 years ago. A tall, silver-bearded man in Hawaiian shirts and worn sneakers, Elliot had seemed more myth than executive. Half retired, half legend. People spoke of him like you'd speak of a storm, unpredictable, disruptive, unforgettable. When he sold his stake and stepped down, most assumed they'd never hear from him again. But his name was still inked at the bottom of her contract. His clause, his signature. And now, he was back. At 9 a.m. sharp, Rachel entered the executive conference room. It was sleek, cold, all glass and leather, designed to intimidate. Around the table sat the board, grim-faced. Dacro the CFO, sweat already glistening at his temple. Karen from HR, eyes darting like a trapped bird. Greg, arms crossed tight, pretending confidence he didn't feel. And at the far end, a massive screen lit up. Elliot Travers filled the frame. Older now, hair wilder, beard fuller, but his presence crackled through the speakers. He leaned back in his chair, a tumbler of coffee, or maybe whiskey, resting in his hand. Well, he said, voice calm, unhurried. Looks like you dug up one of my little surprises. The room stayed silent. No one dared move. Elliot's eyes scanned the faces until they landed on Rachel. He gave the faintest smile, like he'd been expecting her. Ms. Torres. I remember you. Sharp mind. Eyes on the gaps, I told you once. Seems you found a canyon. Rachel's pulse hammered, but her voice was steady. I found the claws you buried. And they tried to erase me. Dacro jumped in, desperate. Elliot, with all due respect, this clause is outdated. It was never meant to be enforced literally. She's using it to derail our IPO. Elliot raised a brow. Outdated? Funny. My signature doesn't expire. Neither does the law. You filed her work without attribution, didn't you? Greg leaned forward, defensive. It was a team effort. She's junior staff. We. Don't, Elliot cut him off, his tone suddenly sharp. Don't insult me with corporate spin. I wrote that clause for a reason. To protect the people who actually build the machine while you clowns polish the hood. The board chair cleared her throat nervously. Mr. Travers, are you saying this clause is enforceable? Even now? I'm not saying it, Elliot replied, eyes narrowing. I signed it. It's binding. Unless Ms. Torres waives her rights, she has co-signatory authority on every initiative derived from her work. The words dropped like a hammer. Karen tried to soften the blow, her voice trembling. Perhaps we can negotiate. Rachel, if you'd consider a fellowship role, additional equity. Rachel cut in, her voice low but cutting. You don't get it. I don't want hush money. I want recognition. My name on my work. That's all. Greg scoffed. This is insane. You can't just. Shut up, Greg, Elliot said flatly. For the first time, Greg went silent. The board shifted uneasily, the balance of power tilting in real time. Investors were circling like sharks, stock prices were slipping, and now the founder himself had sided with Rachel. Elliot leaned closer to the camera, his voice dropping into something dangerous. You've built an empire on shortcuts and theft. Ms. Torres reminded you of something you forgot: contracts matter. Attribution matters. People matter. The room went still. Rachel sat straighter, her binder resting at her fingertips. For the first time, she felt the weight of real power, not borrowed, not stolen, but earned. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply said, "I'm ready to discuss next steps." Elliot raised his glass toward her, like a toast. "Now they'll listen. Make them." The screen went dark. Silence pressed down on the boardroom, heavier than any words. Every eye turned to Rachel. And for the first time in her career, she wasn't invisible. They didn't wait long. Less than 24 hours after the board session with Elliot Travers, Rachel's calendar pinged with a new invite. Career Alignment Discussion, Conference Room 7A. Attendees: Karen L., Greg Stanton, T. Robbins, Strategic Counsel. It was scheduled for 11 a.m. the next day. No subject line. No agenda. Just 3 names that told her everything: HR, her thief of a manager, and a lawyer brought in to clean up the mess. At 10:58, Rachel walked into 7A. The blinds were drawn. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and tension. Karen forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. Greg sat stiffly, his tie crooked, a dark stain on his shirt as if he'd spilled something in his rush. The lawyer, Robbins, was already seated, calm, pen tapping against a leather folder. "Rachel, so glad you could join us," Karen began, voice too bright. "We just wanted to step back from the documents and have a human conversation." Rachel took a seat, folding her hands neatly on the table. "Of course. Go ahead." Greg jumped in immediately. "Look, no one's denying you did good work. But these founder clauses, they're ceremonial. Legacy fluff. We all know that. The last thing we want is for you to feel sidelined, so we're prepared to make this right." Karen nodded eagerly. "Exactly. We think there's a path here that gives you recognition without complicating ongoing initiatives. Something more constructive than enforcing an outdated clause." Robbins finally spoke, his tone clipped, measured. "We're authorized to present you with an offer." He slid a manila folder across the table. Rachel opened it slowly. Inside was a printed document: Senior Strategic Consultant. No team, no direct reports, just an advisory title padded with corporate jargon. A generous salary bump. Retroactive equity, backdated to the day her proposal was implemented. A signing bonus large enough to make most analysts faint. And, of course, a non-disparagement clause so airtight it might as well have banned sarcasm. Rachel read each line carefully while the room waited. Greg leaned forward, sweat glistening at his temples. Karen smiled like she'd already won. Robbins tapped his pen, patient as stone. Finally, Rachel set the folder down. "I see. You want me to disappear." Quietly. Karen rushed to protest. No, this is about recognition, Rachel. This is about giving you space to thrive without conflict." Rachel tilted her head. "Space to thrive. By silencing me?" Greg bristled. "Come on, don't make this harder than it has to be. You can't hold the company hostage over a typo and some slides. Take the deal. It's more than fair." Rachel's voice stayed calm, steady. "Fair would have been my name on the work in the first place. Fair would have been Greg not stealing it." Greg flushed crimson. "That's not." Robbins raised a hand, silencing him. "Rachel, listen. The board doesn't want a fight. Neither do you. Take this offer, and you walk away with money, equity, security. Refuse it." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Refuse it, and things get complicated." Rachel leaned back, studying him. Complicated for who? Silence. Karen shifted in her seat, flustered. We're trying to help you, Rachel. Honestly. Think about your daughter. This offer sets you up for stability. Isn't that what matters most? Rachel's eyes hardened. They'd found her weak spot, and they thought they could use it. She closed the folder gently and slid it back across the table. I decline. Karen blinked. Excuse me? I don't want an advisory role. I don't need hush money. I don't want to disappear. All I want is what the clause guarantees: my name, my rights, my seat at the table. Greg slammed a hand on the table. You'll regret this. Rachel met his glare without flinching. No, Greg. You will. She stood, smoothed her blazer, and walked to the door. Her heart hammered, but her stride was steady. At the threshold, she paused, looked back once, and said, "Tell the board I'm not negotiating. I'm deciding." Then she left, leaving the folder behind like a discarded bribe. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting match could have been. Rachel didn't smile as she walked back to her desk. She wasn't celebrating. She was calculating. Because the offer. Friday morning. 9 a.m. sharp. The executive conference room looked like a courtroom dressed in glass and leather. The board sat in a semicircle, faces taut with a mix of exhaustion and fear. On the screen at the far end of the table was Elliot Travers, the founder, his face half in shadow but his eyes sharp as ever. Rachel sat at the table, a folder in front of her, the same folder she had organized in her living room with sticky notes and color-coded tabs. Every page was proof: timestamps, draft versions, Slack confirmations, rollout memos, investor decks. Her story in paper form. The board chair cleared her throat. Rachel, we've reviewed the clause and the situation. Before we proceed, do you have anything you'd like to say? Rachel opened the folder, slid a single page forward. Yes. I want this on the record. I submitted my proposal. It was implemented without my name. My work was used in investor materials. And per Section 12C of the Founder's Operational Continuity Clause, I hold co-signatory rights over every initiative tied to my contribution. That's not a request. That's the law of this company. Silence hung heavy. The CFO looked pale, his tie askew. Rachel, he started, his voice cracking, be reasonable. The round is at stake. Millions in valuation, hundreds of jobs. Rachel cut him off, calm but sharp. The round is at stake because you tried to erase me. Don't confuse your mistake with my responsibility. Elliot Travers leaned forward on the screen, finally speaking. She's right. The clause was written for this exact reason. To stop people like Greg from burying innovation under politics. His gaze swept across the board. You used her work. You removed her name. Now you face the consequences. Karen from HR shifted uncomfortably. Rachel, perhaps there's a middle ground. Rachel's eyes snapped to hers. You had your chance. You told me we don't negotiate with junior staff. Remember? Karen's face went crimson. The board chair exhaled. Rachel, what do you want? This was the moment. Rachel could have asked for money, titles, a golden parachute. But she wanted something bigger. Something lasting. I want permanent attribution rights on my framework, she said, voice steady. Every project derived from it must carry my name as co-author. And I want veto authority enforced, just as the clause states. No watering down, no advisory exile. Real authority. Finally, she paused, letting the silence stretch. I want protections written into policy so no one else has to go through what I did. The chair blinked. That's significant. Rachel leaned forward. It's non-negotiable. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Travers chuckled softly on the screen. She reminds me of myself, 40 years ago. Give her what she's asking. You'll thank her later. The general counsel cleared his throat. Legally, she's entitled to it. Fighting her would be a disaster. Compliance, investors, even regulators would side with her. It's cleaner to acknowledge her standing. The CFO groaned into his hands. Finally, the board chair nodded. Very well. Rachel, you'll receive updated documentation by end of week. Your rights will be codified into governance policy. Rachel closed her folder. Good. She stood. For a moment, she looked at each face in turn, the CFO's defeated glare, Karen's shame, the silent fear etched into every line of the board's posture. Then she turned and walked out, heels echoing against polished floors like a gavel-ending trial. As she stepped into the cold air outside, Rachel didn't smile. She didn't need to. She felt something deeper, vindication. Not the loud, fiery kind, but the quiet certainty of someone who had been underestimated, erased, and yet carved her name into the bedrock of the company. On Monday, intern